In November 1987, 32-year-old Shirley Ellis disappeared whilst hitchhiking along Delaware's Route 40 highway. Not long after she vanished, two teenagers stumbled across a horrific sight: the brutally tortured body of the young woman, who had been strangled and beaten to death with a hammer. Ellis was a former prostitute who turning her life around and studying to be a nurse, and her murder shocked the residents of New Castle County. Detectives suspected she may have been killed by a trucker using the interstate, and many thought her murder would go unsolved. Around 7 months later, another young woman was found brutally murdered in much the same circumstances, whilst a third was missing, presumed dead. New Castle County detectives conferred with the FBI and realized they were now dealing with a possible serial killer operating along Route 40, and a hastily assembled task force was formed from local and state police. Forensic officers found blue carpet fibers on the body of one victim, and tire tracks from one crime scene were thought to belong to the killer's vehicle. But it would be the efforts of a female undercover officer that would ensure the capture of Delaware's only documented serial killer. It was 3 days after the holiday had ended, but 23-year-old Shirley Ann Ellis was taking a Thanksgiving platter to Wilmington Hospital for an AIDS patient undergoing treatment. She had left her family home in Newark's Brookmont Farms development shortly before 6:00 p.m. on November 29, 1987 to make the 14-mile journey. She began walking along Route 40, an area she knew well from her days as a prostitute. But she had left the world of a streetwalker behind, and was attending nursing school. At some point during her walk, she must have decided to catch a ride, and hitchhiked along Route 40, the area just south of Wilmington, which would have been a faster way to get to the city. At around 9:25 p.m. that evening, two teenagers looking for the ideal makeout spot came across a body, that of Shirley Ellis. When police arrived on the scene, they found Ellis' partly clothed body discarded on the ground with her legs spread apart. The autopsy revealed the full extent of her ordeal at the hands of her killer. She had been bound at the wrists and ankles, tortured and mutilated with what appeared to be work tools, and there was black duct tape, likely used to prevent her from screaming, still attached to strands of her hair. Although there was no evidence of sexual assault, she suffered greatly before her killer wrapped a ligature around her neck and repeatedly struck her over the head with a hammer. Investigators were perplexed by this vicious and senseless murder, and Kathleen Jennings, who would serve as a state prosecutor in the case, said, "There was no reason for Shirley Ellis to be killed, no angry boyfriend or anything that would connect a murderer to her death." For a time, people believed it was an interstate trucker. 7 months later, another body was found, that of 31-year-old divorcee Catherine DeMoro, who had been walking along Route 40 at around 11:30 p.m. on June 28, 1988. She had a history of prostitution arrests, but it was not known if she was working the night she vanished after accepting a ride from a stranger driving a blue van. Her body was found at 6:26 a.m. the next morning, by workers building the Fox Run apartment complex. DeMoro was found in similar circumstances to Shirley Ellis, with her wrists and ankles bound and black duct tape covering her mouth, except she was completely naked. Once again, there was no sign of sexual activity, but she had been tortured sadistically with work tools. The manner of her death was the same too. She had been strangled with a ligature and bludgeoned with a hammer. New Castle County Police Captain James Hedrick, who would eventually join the task force to hunt the killer, would later recall, "Everything was consistent with the Ellis case. We felt that the same person was responsible for both murders." There was a significant difference, however, because the killer had left a clue on DeMoro's body, in the form of blue carpet fibers which covered her from head to toe. A week later, the task force was formed from officers of the Delaware State Police and the New Castle County Police Department, with its own headquarters near the New Castle County Airport. With roughly 60 members, it was for a time the state's third largest police department. "We had access to an airplane, helicopters and rental vehicles," Hendricks recalls. "Money wasn't an issue. I don't know anyone who has ever worked for a government agency where money wasn't an issue. We had an unlimited budget." The task force met with members of the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit at Quantico, Virginia. It was the conclusion of the Bureau that a serial killer was responsible for the crimes in Delaware, and was using Route 40, the only connection between the two victims, as a means of hunting for victims. The task force assigned female officers dressed as prostitutes to work the stretch of highway looking for any potential suspects. These undercover officers would engage in flirtatious talk with men who stopped, but they never got inside a vehicle. Other officers worked to identify the unusual fibers found on the body of Catherine DeMoro. On August 22, 1988, another prostitute went missing. Margaret Lynn Finner was working the streets along Route 13, a major junction of Route 40. Witnesses reported seeing her get inside a blue Ford Pennell van with round headlights driven by a white male. Newcastle County Police Officer Renee Toshner had been one of the female officers working undercover posing as a prostitute. On September 14, 1988, she had been walking along Route 40 in an attempt to turn up any clues that might solve the case. On that particular day, Toshner had been routinely approached by men. As Hendrick remembers, "We had a gamut of people stop for her. Doctors, lawyers, school teachers. At one point, there was a line of 5 or 6 vehicles with men waiting to talk to her. One point a blue Ford Pennell van with round headlights drove past, then stopped a little further down the road, before turning around." Toshner estimates the van had driven past her no less than 7 times in the space of 20 minutes. When she walked to a more secluded spot, the van stopped and a white male opened the side panel. Toshner immediately noticed the blue carpet lining the van's interior. She was also aware of the driver's coldness towards her. "He was different than any other person who stopped for me," she recalls. "It was hard to get into a conversation. He wasn't in the moment. He was looking right through me." Knowing they were looking for a van similar in description and with carpet covering the interior, Toshner took that opportunity to playfully rub her hand along the carpeting on the floor of the van, pulling out the fibers to be tested. When the driver demanded that she get in the van, Toshner refused. She made an excuse about being tired from partying all day and needed sleep. The driver became suspicious and drove off. Whilst Toshner spoke with the occupant of the van, Hendrick ran the plates and found it was registered to Stephen Pennell, a Delaware electrician with no criminal record. The search for the killer intensified in the weeks that followed, and task force members sent the fibers to a lab for testing and also secured a search warrant to follow Pennell. Meanwhile, the killer accelerated his activities too. On September 16, 1988, he struck again. Michelle Gordon, a 22-year-old Newcastle resident and known prostitute, went missing and was last seen on Route 40, getting into the passenger seat of a blue Ford Pennell van. This time, however, a lone witness saw the abduction who knew and recognized both Gordon and Pennell. She immediately identified the vehicle. 3 days later, another Brookmont Farms resident, 26-year-old Kathleen Meyer, was last seen alive hitchhiking along Route 40. An off-duty police officer reported seeing Meyer accepting a ride from a stranger in a blue Ford van. Aware of the van's connection to the murders, the suspicious officer jotted down the license plate number, which was registered to Pennell. At this stage in the investigation, the task force was monitoring Pennell's every move, and Toshner even sat next to him during a stakeout at a Moody Blues concert. She would recall the heartbreaking moment when his daughter approached the undercover officer to ask for a donation to a school fundraiser. "She was a kid, and you never want any child to experience what was happening," says Toshner. On September 20, 1988, the body of Michelle Gordon washed up on the rocky banks of the Chesapeake and Amp, Delaware Canal. Gordon was a cocaine addict and she was the only victim who died whilst being tortured. The medical examiner would later testify that the drugs in her system meant her heart was incapable of withstanding the shock of her beating. A search warrant was approved by Delaware Attorney General Charles Oberle to search Pennell's van. The suspect had been pulled over during a routine traffic violation and appeared in court to pay his ticket. During an infrequent but legal method for the police to detain a suspect, police then used that opportunity to search his vehicle, which provided more evidence than they ever thought they would get. They discovered carpet fibers that matched those on the victims, as well as hair and blood samples, along with the same brand of duct tape used on Ellis and DeMoro. They also found his so-called torture kit, which consisted of pliers, handcuffs, a whip, knives, needles and other restraints. Exactly 1 year after he claimed his first victim, on November 29, 1988, an arrest warrant was issued for Stephen Pennell. He was charged with the murders of Shirley Ellis, Catherine DeMoro and Michelle Gordon. In the face of mounting evidence, the suspect exercised his right to remain silent. During the same month of his arrest, the body of Margaret Lynn Finner was found near the Chesapeake and Amp, Delaware Canal. Her body was in such an advanced state of decay that a cause of death couldn't be determined. Under questioning, Pennell refused to admit his guilt in the murders. Hendricks described him as your typical, all-American person. He came across as a totally normal married father with no criminal record. No one would ever look at his background and see signs that this could happen. No one would ever suspect him of anything. Prior to the trial, Pennell's defense attorney Eugene Maurer attempted to question the validity of the fiber evidence, arguing that Toshner didn't have the authority to seize the strands. However, Superior Court Judge Richard Gebeline denied Maurer's claims, concluding that the carpet was in plain view when Pennell opened the door to entice Toshner inside the van. Oberle would admit, the fibers led to everything else. If that was ruled inadmissible, everything else would have been kept out under the fruit of the poisonous tree legal doctrine. That could have been devastating. Although he would not be charged for the murders of Finner and Meyer, primarily because there was little evidence left in the case of Finner, and Meyer's body has never been found. State Prosecutor Kathleen Jennings planned to enter more than blue fibers. Her team had DNA evidence. At the time of his trial, there were only 2 other criminal cases in the United States that had permitted its introduction, and the Pennell case would be the first time DNA evidence was used in a criminal trial. Judge Gebeline would admit, there was a learning curve, there weren't a lot of experts in that field, and there was no case law to ensure the evidence was introduced correctly. I had to let the scientists testify and then make a decision whether their actions were legally sound. Thank you for listening to part 1 of the Route 40 Killer. If you made it this far, please hit the like button and also hit the notification bell so that you'll know when we post a new video.